Open source hardware is a term for tangible artifacts, machines, devices, or other physical things whose design has been released to the public in such a way that anyone can make, modify, distribute, and use those things. Part of a working draft of the open source hardware definition. This was discussed at the first Open Hardware Summit organized by Alicia Gibb and Aya Badir in 2010 and held at the New York Hall of Science. 10 years later, this same paragraph remains part of the definition, published by the Open Source Hardware Association, OSHWA.
My name is Alicia Gibb, and I am the Executive Director and the founder of the Open Source Hardware Association. The Open Source Hardware Association spun out of the Open Source Summits that I started with Aya Badir a decade ago. We had our 10-year anniversary this year. I also work at the university here in Boulder, Colorado, and I run a hackerspace called the Blow Things Up Lab.
Michael Weinberg has written an article in the current issue of Make, volume 75, titled Open Source Hardware Turns 10. In it, he writes, "It is appropriate that 10 years after the first Open Hardware Summit, open source hardware was a key part of the initial COVID-19 response." He has also written, with Clarissa Redwine, the Open Source Hardware Weather Report 2020.
I am the president of the board of the Open Source Hardware Association. I've been in that role for a little while, done a bunch of stuff with Alicia over the years. One of the projects I spent a lot of time on is the Open Source Hardware Certification Program that we have. My day job is I'm the executive director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at NYU. Another thing that had historically brought me to this community was I don't have an engineering background, but I have a legal background. And so some of the kind of legal licensing questions around hardware really initially brought me in, and I don't get to blow things up.
Welcome to MakeCast, a podcast about how we make the world better. I'm Dale Doherty. MakeCast is brought to you by the members of Make Community, who support makers in their community and around the world. To learn more about membership, visit make.co. Open source hardware came together as a thing about 10 years ago. While open source software is much older, and some early efforts to define open source hardware date back to the 1990s, a community catalyzed around a shared definition of open source hardware. In this conversation with Alicia Gibb and Michael Weinberg, I explore how the open source hardware community is flourishing 10 years later. Open source hardware is not just a definition or a technical specification. It is a social expression of shared values, a compact which has legal as well as cultural implications.
I mean, a lot of times when I talk to people about open source hardware, one of the things I talk about that excites me about the community is the diversity of the community across a number of different metrics, and really about how it's such a creative community. And it's a community that really sees itself as a community with intentionality and really sees its kind of collective purpose to create interesting, creative, innovative works across a huge range. Many people first contact with open source hardware is something that plugs in, right? Something that requires batteries or soldering. Right. But we have great examples of open source hardware in the sort of fashion world, in the other parts of the art world, and seeing this breadth of people who come in and say, I'm interested in making things with physicality, right? Hardware, physical things in an open, collaborative way has been really inspiring. And I think that a lot of that is very closely connected, if not intrinsically intertwined with the larger maker movement, and thinking about how all these groups come together and say, what we're primarily motivated by is the act of coming together to create things that are worthwhile for us as individuals and us as communities. And it's true that there is infrastructure, that is social infrastructure, that is legal infrastructure, that is technical infrastructure that needs to be in place to help support that, or at least it works better when that infrastructure is in place. But it's not about the infrastructure, right? It's about that community and about that coming together.
Alicia, when you founded the association, who were its initial members and who were you representing?
So we tried to get some legal, manufacturing, education, a whole mix of people who would be able to vet our organization as we were building it through all of those different fields. And really at that time, who we were working for was a much smaller collective than today, but it was very much in the electronics industry.
Yeah.
So that is where open source hardware got its start. It was a bunch of startups, right?
Yeah.
It was a bunch of small companies. And now we're having to wrap our heads around, okay, how does Texas Instruments and Intel feel about this statement of open source hardware? And how do we talk to those companies as well as still being accessible to all the smaller companies? One of the wonderful things we've done over the years that Michael's really led the charge on was the certification. So getting something that sort of looks and feels more official for open source hardware, I think is going to move the community just in a bigger, broader way forward.
There was a period of time when people could just put the logo on their product and say it's open source hardware. There was no certification that it actually was. Is that what we mean here?
So there's the Open Gear logo that I think a lot of people are familiar with. That's fantastic. And that is really powerful and important to the community. And it is an open logo in the sense that no one controls it, which I think has a number of fantastic benefits. But one of the challenges is anyone can put it on anything. And so it can mean as much or as little as that person wants it to mean. The good faith version of this is that there was a mismatch between creators who were saying, this is open source hardware, and users who were expecting things from open source hardware. And those definitions weren't quite matching up. I think there's also a bad faith version where people were just running around and saying, this is open source hardware when it clearly wasn't. In either case, there was a need, an interest in the community in having a way to say, look, we have this community definition of open source hardware. And so we need a way for someone to say, when I say open source hardware, I'm talking about this community definition of open source hardware that OSHWA is the steward of. And when I am looking at things that are saying they're open source hardware, I want a way to know what they're talking about when they say open source hardware. And so the certification program was designed, and it still is it from OSHWA. It's a free program where if you're creating hardware and you want to show that when you say open source hardware, you are talking about hardware that complies with the community definition, you apply. Again, it's free. It gets reviewed by our team. And then you get two things. You get the permission to use a specific certification logo. It's not the Open Gear logo. It's the certification logo. And you get a unique identifier, which then allows people to find all of your documentation easily through the certification site.
So it's a standard and practice, in effect.
It's funny that when I started OSHWA, I didn't really think that we were going to end up as a standards organization, but it's very much the direction that OSHWA has moved. When we started it, it was an umbrella organization for the summit, to fund the summit. But definitely our community has said loud and clear, we want more standards and we want more, a little bit more legal teeth to this concept of open source hardware.
Let me ask you, what kind of teeth do you have?
It really varies because, again, no one owns the term open source hardware. No one owns the Open Gear logo. And so nothing prevents someone in bad faith from running around and saying, this is open source hardware. And that's part of the openness of the community. When someone is using the certification logo and saying this is open source hardware and it's certified open source hardware, that's a logo that OSHWA controls. OSHWA owns the trademark for the logo. And so if someone is using that logo without permission, and the only way to get permission is to go through the certification process, OSHWA does have the ability to ultimately sue someone for trademark infringement. We fortunately have never gotten to that point. We've had a couple of instances where we had conversations with people who we thought were using the certification logo improperly, and those were all resolved totally amicably. One of the values of the certification is there is a legal backstop to it that allows OSHWA to say, no, you really do need permission to use this logo. It's one of the complications in open source hardware. The licensing environment is a little bit more complex than open source software. And so it gives you some kind of backstop. Very briefly, software is born closed in the sense that it's automatically eligible for copyright protection. The second you write it, it's wrapped up in copyright protection for your life plus 70 years after you're dead.
In the U.S.
Actually, in most countries, software is going to be protected by copyright. And so if you want someone to use it, you have to affirmatively pick a license and grant them permission. And that's been the strength, one of the foundations of open source software. Hardware is not as universally protected by copyright or patent or something else. It's a little bit idiosyncratic to the hardware. Obviously, any software involved is protected. Hardware might or might not be protected. It's a more complex landscape. And so the guidance that we give as part of the certification process is to think about licensing in 3 different parts. Think about licensing the software, if there is any software. Think about licensing the hardware, and think about licensing your documentation. And if you go to the certification site, we walk through your different options. We use examples of what other people have used. Generally speaking, there's sort of 2 conceptual approaches. One is a kind of omni license. The CERN, especially the CERN version 2 open hardware licenses that came out this year, do a really great job of saying, look, there's one license that protects the software, the hardware, and the documentation. It's all in one place, and it all works. For other people who want to rely on licenses they know better, we say, okay, pick your GPL for your software, right? Pick a Creative Commons license for your documentation. Maybe also pick a Creative Commons license for your hardware, knowing that ultimately your ability as a hardware creator to impose obligations of openness on users may not be as strong as that ability in the software context, but it's still valuable to be able to use licenses to communicate to users who are operating in good faith what you want them to do. Because most people in this community, most people in the world, I think, want to do the right thing. And so licenses can still be an effective social signal. Say, hey, I put this out to the world. I hope you use it, and I hope you contribute back to it, or I hope you use it and do whatever you want. You just need to understand, as a hardware creator, you may or may not have the same legal ability to force people to comply. But truth be told, even in the open source software world, those licenses are rarely litigated. They, in many ways, also operate as a social signal.
Where a lot of open source hardware started as a community effort. Some of those startups that Alicia mentioned became bigger. They've got investors. Some of them became strongly commercial entities, and open source hardware was a little bit at odds with perhaps what their investors wanted. And so they changed course. I'm obviously talking about MakerBot, but there were other examples too. How has that sort of evolved? That was actually a really painful moment, I have to say, in the maker community, as well as probably specifically in open source hardware community.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I haven't seen a whole lot of open source hardware companies taking VC since kind of that era. And I think you're right. I think it was painful for the community. It was seeing one of our leaders fall from grace a little bit, seeing what we thought would never happen kind of thing. But it certainly hasn't slowed down the open source hardware community or movement. We had other 3D printing companies that got just as big that open sourced their 3D printers, and other companies that have gotten to the employment rate that MakerBot was at and things like that. So it's clear that that's not an end-all be-all recipe for your business model in open source hardware. There's a lot of other business models out there that have proven to work. I was wondering if people would be afraid to do open source hardware and to let their kind of designs out there in the world just to be possibly eaten up by VCs. And that really hasn't happened. People they're doing this for other reasons and for other reasons that are marketable. I love asking the question when I give talks, how many people buy a product based on the number of patents it has. I have yet to see anyone raise their hand for that question. People buy things because of how fast it can ship, or their customer service is awake when you're awake, or the color and the features and the size and whatever. And it really proves within hardware that that's really why people are buying products. If you can beat the market on those functions, then you've got a good business model.
That sort of violation was a violation of a community compact in a way. These products were really ecosystems of developers and contributors. And the reason to be open is to allow that exchange back and forth. So when you put up the wall and say, we now own everything and you don't, that exchange stops. If there's really a core idea behind open source hardware, is that ecosystem of contributors is a value engine for potentially your company, your product, cause, meaning getting things into education cheaply and spreading it widely. And most importantly, it's a choice. It's not something you have to do, but if you do, it has some benefits. That's why I'm glad to see you get to 10 years.
Yeah.
That ecosystem is developing and continues to grow.
And I really like to also point out that the community is such a huge value to open source hardware. The community is as important as your business model, because
it is your business model.
Yeah, it is. For example, if Arduino, the company, went away tomorrow, Arduinos would still be produced all around the world in their derivative form. The community would still keep up the software and the IDE. It would not cease to exist just because the company did. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about your legacy living on as a piece of open source hardware. If you truly just want that piece of open source hardware to exist, if you want that piece of hardware at all to exist, open source it, because then it will exist past yourself and past what innovations you could think of in an entire world of people dreaming up innovations.
I used to talk to inventors who say, I don't want to share my product because people will steal it from me. And I go, well, you've been a frustrated inventor for 20 years and none of your products have been stolen and nobody knows who you are. Maybe there's another way to do it. This is just a choice. We're not saying everybody has to give things away or share them, but there are benefits to that. You have this alternate path. Mm-hmm. I don't think open source is the only way and proprietary isn't the only way, but this way has proven really valuable, this open source hardware way.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we had to do is create this document on, here's your checklist of everything you have to do in open source hardware. And one of the things we had to add to it early on was a question of, are you emotionally prepared to be copied? Because we would get emails at the association that was like, hey, I open sourced my hardware and I did it right and somebody copied me. What are you going to do about it? And we would just say, congratulations, you did it correctly. You did it right. And it really points to you creating a successful product, because not everybody wants to copy everything out there.
Right. One of the things that we talk about, it's important not to open, is your trademark. And sometimes I tell people trademark law is the flux capacitor of open source hardware. It's what makes open source hardware possible. Because in a world of exact copies and clones, the one thing that you've held on to as a company is your name. And you're saying, look, you can buy this board with the same plans from 20 different people. But again, with hardware as opposed to software, it really matters who built the thing.
The clone of Arduino can't be called Arduino.
And so that's really powerful. And that's the one thing that they're not opening. They're saying, look, this is how you know it's ours.
I think in the early days of the community, there was a lot of implicit understanding about what this means. It wasn't legal. This is how you should behave. And some people followed that and some people didn't. Right. And it wasn't clear how you learned what those implicit understandings were.
Yeah, I think that's why we have this trail of documents. So it started with the definition and then people picked out, what does that really mean from the definition? So then we ended up writing the best practices. And then we extended that into an entire book. It all stems into why we also did the certification, to really bring clarity to exactly what it means. And now you can go through this process where we even check out for you to make sure that you're doing everything to our standards.
There's those unwritten rules for the community and figuring out how to make them, the important parts of those rules keep going in the community. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But also we were worried that those unwritten rules became a barrier to entry. We didn't want someone saying, I'm really interested in doing open source hardware. I think I am doing it right, but I'm worried that if I come in and saying I'm doing open source hardware and I don't follow one of the unwritten rules, then
you get called out.
One of the roles of the certification program, and this actually has happened over the years, is if you get certified by OSHWA and then people come after you and say, oh, that's not really open source hardware, OSHWA can stand behind you as a new person in the community and say, no, look, we think that they were following the rules. It may be that they weren't, and we'll all work this out together, but they were acting in good faith and they have someone in the community welcoming them and saying, we'll stand behind you if someone gets angry at you on the internet.
I've looked to other organizations that are really welcoming for communities, things like the Grace Hopper Institute or the ADA initiative when it was around. So it's playing off those organizations to try to figure out how else can we be more inclusive and how else can we make sure that our community is feeling welcomed and things like that. So that's where even the Ada Lovelace Fellowship stemmed from, was just this push that we wanted our open source hardware community, when a new person came in, we didn't want their first experience to be somebody yelling at them on the internet. I think it's interesting too that we mostly have to deal with companies, and companies are also a bit, I think, financially motivated to have more people buying their products. Right. So companies don't want to exclude people on purpose from purchasing their products. So I think there's also a natural sort of fit that we have in terms of our communities. A lot of companies are trying to educate people in a nice, kind way about how to solder, how to sew, or how to do something. And I think that this goes hand in hand with the maker community as well, right? Like, it's based on trying to teach people other skills. Yep. And I think when you're doing that, you're going to have most success if you're just nice about it.
Absolutely. Michael, what do you see in the COVID-19 response that tells you both of maybe the value of open source hardware, but also maybe some of what it needs to accomplish in the future?
This is something that's very front of mind, and not just because we're in the middle of a COVID crisis, but I'm actually working on a project right now with the Wilson Center, where we've actually brought together a bunch of the leaders of the different parts of that open source hardware medical response to COVID and just talk to them about what their experience was like. And I think you're right. On one hand, it's an incredibly inspiring story where, as you've said, the government did not maintain their supply chain, businesses did not maintain the supply chain. And so a bunch of people came together. While there were informal networks that had grown up around maker spaces, maker fairs, those communities, they certainly weren't designed for medical devices. Right. They came together and they figured out how to design, make, and distribute, in a lot of ways from scratch, a huge range of hardware. And so I think that is like a huge credit and validation to the open source hardware model. At the same time, I think that because there was a lack of coordination, it was hard for everyone involved in that process to match supply and demand signals very effectively. You tended to have communities grow up around things that they thought were important because of press coverage, or that were the interesting sorts of projects to the people who were coming together that weren't necessarily the most useful and important projects. And so it was a failure, I think, in a lot of ways of especially government to help coordinate. And I don't mean that from a command and control standpoint, but just a kind of distributing information standpoint. Yeah. And then there's just this open question on the regulatory side, right? On one hand, there's a good reason that our medical regulatory structure has been built to assume that a company that is fully insured, that is paying people full time, is going to be the ones designing, manufacturing, and distributing medical supplies. That's a completely reasonable thing. But I think there's two lessons that come out of COVID. One is, in an emergency, it's important for there to be a pathway for people to be able to fill those gaps. And then also, after an emergency, there may be other kinds of hardware that it's actually okay to have that kind of more community approach. And so I hope coming out of this, medical regulators will think about when it is appropriate to expand the circle of people involved in production, and then create structures that are accessible and understandable to those people, assuming they're not going to have extensive regulatory counsel, and we're just trying to fix it.
I think that's well said. I think what we've seen specifically is that something like the FDA approves manufacturers of designs, not the design itself. And so when you say, hey, could you approve an open source design, that just doesn't have any meaning to them. It's who's making it. And the idea that someone's making on a 3D printer and you have a different 3D printer in a different place and different practice around that, that's very confusing to them.
I think where open source hardware has really shined in all this is at that collaboration level. Yeah. When you saw Medtronic post their ventilator files in a more open way, they didn't open source them or whatnot, but hey, it's in the right trajectory. Yeah. But the reason they did it is because they needed a whole community of inventors looking at it and thinking through the issues. They needed the efficiency of open source.
Artisans Asylum, the makerspace in Somerville, Massachusetts, does a terrific job. They were making a number of different things. One of them was hospital gowns. And while we tend to think of IP associated with a design, they had created a manufacturing process and documented it and said, this is how many people you need. This is what this person does. And it goes to this person, it goes that. And when they were able to, first of all, they were able to get other makerspaces doing it by sharing that. They were even able to get commercial manufacturers who said, how do you make these? Well, we've documented that. And it seemed to me like a new level of documentation that we hadn't seen before is process documentation.
Absolutely.
It takes seriously the idea that other people are going to be making this and building on it. And so if they're going to do that, talk to them about how to do it. Don't just hand them the plans and say good luck.
And it's the difference between, say, an Instructable or a project in Make, where it's written for a single person to do, but now it's, hey, this is a group process that is concerned with efficiency and cost and all these other things.
It's manufacturing. It's instead of doing your personal project.
Exactly. It's production.
Manufacturing.
Right. What do you think the next 10 years of Open Source Hardware Association will get you into?
The path that we're looking at right now is the educational institutions in the country and everywhere. We think that it's important to get students interested in open source hardware and understand that if somebody can see transparently your work in a GitHub repo, they're more likely to hire you. They've seen your work. Getting professors and researchers to use open source hardware, getting them to understand the value proposition behind purchasing open source hardware instead of purchasing proprietary stuff, getting universities to understand the metrics of contributing to open source hardware projects, and getting funding institutions to recognize, especially public funding institutions, to recognize that there is another option in the intellectual property landscape, which is open source, rather than always going through the patent route through the university's offices to do that. So we're hoping to capture, I think, a lot more people in our community. And as I said before, this has started in electronics, but now we have like camping gear that's been open source hardware. It's awesome. And so and now with all of the COVID stuff, I think we're going to hear a lot more medical devices being certified and open sourced and things like that. I don't know where we're going to stop in the number of fields that we're able to bring under our umbrella, but I'm sure in the next 10 years, we will have a lot more fields than we do now.
Those academic pathways are super important. I think one of the revolutions in open access over the last 10 or 15 years is that grant makers started saying, if we're going to pay for you to write this report or build this data set, you need to release it under a Creative Commons license or some sort of open license. And having grant makers take that next step and say, if we're going to pay you to develop a bunch of hardware, you really need to figure out how to open source that hardware. And that's just part of the expectation in that world.
I'd like to see the governments take more of the lead in this also. They're giving out money through small business loans or NSF and others, that we need to see more open source hardware, not just because it's somehow vaguely good. We have to imagine that we need more public infrastructure that's available to more people, that empowers more people.
I think one of the great lessons of the open data movement and the open government movement is that when we collectively fund the creation of a resource, it is worth our ability to be able to collectively make use of that resource. And so when you think about all the things that we invest in publicly in terms of hardware, it's dumb not to open it back up so everyone can use it. And again, like you said, it doesn't have to be an altruistic decision. It doesn't have to be a kind of out of the goodness of your heart. It's a savvy business move. It's an efficient use of resources to make sure that people who paid in to create the thing can then use it for other things.
Alicia, I noticed one of the pictures here has you, Aya Badir, Becky Stern, and Lemore Freed. In many ways, the origins of this open source hardware movement is really the efforts of a group of women that came together and made this happen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. And every chance we get, we try to put diverse people on stage at our summits and within our organization. And we really try to make that a conscious effort, because I do think it's amazing that Aya and I met and decided to do this crazy summit thing. And we had the backing of people like you who were like, hey, sure, use the Museum of Science. And so we pulled it off. I am always grateful for how many women have been in leadership roles in our community. Yeah. And I think that's a big reason why our community stems from this concept of wanting to be welcoming to our newcomers and wanting to have a good experience with open source hardware.
Thank you for listening to MakeCast. If you have thoughts about this podcast, please send them to me at makecast@make.co.